What if the person you were taught to hate ended up being the one who saved your life? It's not the kind of question most people expect to ask themselves. Not on a battlefield where every second is a fight to survive. But for one American soldier, that question would haunt him for years, buried deep beneath a silence that lasted a full decade. 10 years without speaking about what happened. 10 years avoiding the truth because it didn't fit into the story the world expected him to tell. He had served with honor. He had followed orders. He had done what soldiers do until one day, in the middle of chaos and gunfire, the lines between friend and enemy blurred in a way that would change his life forever. That moment wasn't marked by a bullet or a medal. It was marked by an act of humanity so unexpected, so unthinkable, that he didn't know how to explain it. Not even to himself. Have you ever been through something so profound that you couldn't put it into words? Something that didn't just challenge what you believed, shattered it completely. That was the reality for this man when he came home. He could talk about the heat of the desert, the weight of the gear, the adrenaline of combat, but not about that. Not about the day an enemy did something no one could have predicted in the years that followed. He disappeared into the quiet. Friends drifted away. Family stopped asking questions. He worked jobs that didn't require small talk, kept his head down in public, and built a life that looked fine from the outside but felt hollow inside. Because deep down, there was still that day, still that moment on the battlefield, still the memory of someone who wasn't supposed to care, but did. What you're about to discover now may surprise you, not just because of what happened, but because of what it reveals about the human spirit when stripped down to its rawest form. This isn't just a war story. It's not about victories or losses, heroes or villains. It's about two men on opposite sides of a war who met in a single heartbeat of truth, and how that heartbeat echoed for 10 long years of silence. Imagine carrying that kind of story inside you. Every time you thought about telling it, you worried people wouldn't understand. They might question your loyalty, your judgment, even your identity as a soldier. So you lock it away. You bury it under routine, under the noise of everyday life. But secrets have a way of whispering when it's quiet, and sooner or later, they demand to be heard. Stay with me until the end, because the way this story unfolds will challenge the way you see not just war, but the people we're told are our enemies. It will make you question the labels, the sides, the black and white lines we draw when life is often made of grays. And maybe, just maybe, it will remind you of the moments in your own life when help came from the last place you expected. One day, after 10 years of silence, he decided to speak, not to glorify the past or to settle a score, but to honor a truth he could no longer keep inside. And when he finally told the world what happened on that battlefield, the story didn't just belong to him anymore. It became a window into something bigger, something we all need to see. That's where we begin. And it starts not with the war itself, but with the man he was before everything changed. Before we step into that chapter of his life, I want to pause with you for a moment, not to break the story, but to invite you into it. Because stories like this, they aren't just mine to tell or his to remember. They live on when they're live, when they're shared, when they spark conversations, when they connect strangers who realize they're not so different after all. If this topic resonates with you, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Maybe you've lived through something that challenged what you believed. Or maybe you've seen compassion in a place you never expected it. Your perspective matters not just to me, but to everyone who finds their way to this story. And if you feel that what we're uncovering here is worth hearing, click the like button. It might seem like a small gesture, but it's what helps these moments travel farther, reaching people who might need to hear them right now, people who, like this soldier once was, are sitting in silence, wondering if anyone would understand. Subscribe to the channel If you want to walk with me through more stories like this, real, raw, and human, your participation is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of message. Each time you comment, like, or subscribe, you're not just supporting a video, you're helping build a space where stories of resilience and unexpected humanity can be told without fear of being forgotten. Now, let's step back in time to the man he was before the silence began, and to the moment everything he thought he knew about the enemy and about himself was about to be rewritten. Chapter 1. Who he was before the silence swallowed him, before the weight of an unspoken truth pressed into every corner of his life. He was just a young man from Ohio named Daniel Hayes. He grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other's middle names, where Friday nights meant football games and Sunday mornings meant church with his parents. He was the kind of guy who would help you change a flat tire in the rain without thinking twice, who could make kids laugh with silly impressions, who carried his grandfather's old watch everywhere like a quiet reminder of the values he'd been taught: loyalty, doing the right thing even when no one's looking. When Daniel enlisted, it wasn't out of some romanticized vision of glory. It was more about responsibility. After his father passed away suddenly, he felt a pull to step up, to prove he could carry weight without breaking. The uniform became both a shield and a statement. He was ready to face whatever came, even if it meant putting himself in harm's way. He went through boot camp with the same determination he had on the football field, pushing past exhaustion, memorizing every detail, learning to follow orders without hesitation. But war, as he would soon learn, isn't just about orders. It's about moments you can't prepare for: the sudden burst of gunfire in the middle of quiet, the look in a fellow soldier's eyes when they realize they might not make it home, the smell of dust and metal and fear that clings to your clothes long after you've left the fight. Daniel deployed to the Middle East in his early 20s, carrying the optimism of youth alongside the heavy rucksack on his back. At first, he believed he could keep himself separate from the darker parts of what he saw. He wrote letters home, filled with safe details, sunsets over the desert, the camaraderie of his unit, the strange comfort of instant coffee in the middle of nowhere. He avoided talking about the explosions that rattled their camp at night or the civilians caught in crossfire. But little by little, the lines between who he was and what he was living through began to blur. The laughter came less often. Sleep became something he grabbed in restless fragments. The enemy wasn't just an abstract figure anymore. It had faces, voices, sometimes even eyes that looked far too much like his own. Every mission was a gamble. Every street could hide danger. And yet, amid all the chaos, there were moments of stillness he couldn't forget. Watching a child chase a ball through an alley while soldiers passed by. Hearing the distant call to prayer mixing with the hum of generators at base. Seeing a local shopkeeper risk opening his store just so life could feel normal for one more day. These glimpses of humanity were like cracks in the armor, reminders that war wasn't a clean division between good and bad, was a tangled mess of survival, fear, and unexpected connection. Daniel's role in the field was dangerous and unrelenting. As a combat medic, he was often the first one running toward the injured, whether they were friends or strangers. The responsibility weighed heavily. Sometimes he saved lives. Sometimes he didn't. And each loss etched itself into him like a scar you couldn't see but could always feel. His mindset shifted from thinking about victory to simply getting his brothers in arms through the day alive. There was one day in particular, a mission in the outskirts of a rural town, when everything began to shift. He didn't know it at the time, but the events of that day would follow him long after he returned home. It wasn't marked by a heroic rescue or a devastating defeat, but by a single decision made in the middle of chaos. A decision that would plant a seed of doubt and wonder deep inside him. Back home, That decision would replay in his mind like a film on loop. He would wake up in the middle of the night with the same image burned into his thoughts, the same voice echoing in his head. But in those early days before the silence, he still told himself it was just another mission, that it didn't mean anything. That he could forget. The truth, though, has a way of lingering. It sits in the quiet spaces between conversations, behind the smiles you show to keep people from asking questions. And for Daniel, that truth was already taking root. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because understanding who Daniel was, how his beliefs were shaped, makes it clear why what happened next would shake him to his core. The way he viewed the world, the way he defined right and wrong, would be tested in a way he never expected. Comment here. I can picture him if you can already see. It's Daniel's journey unfolding in your mind. Chapter 2. The Invisible Scars. The scars Daniel carried home weren't the kind anyone could see. His body was intact and no bandages, no casts, no visible wounds to explain the way he sometimes winced at sudden noises or scanned a room, like he was measuring every possible exit. To the neighbors back in Ohio, he looked like the same. Chapter 3. A decade of isolation. 10 years is a long time to carry a truth you can't share. For Daniel, those years unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, like pages in a book no one else was allowed to read. He returned to Ohio, but it wasn't the same Ohio he'd left. The town still had the same diner with the flickering neon sign, the same park where kids played baseball in the summer, the same neighbors who waved when he passed by. But for him, it all felt dimmer, like someone had turned down the saturation. On the world, at first, people tried to reach him. Old friends invited him to barbecues. Coworkers asked him to grab a beer after work. His mother called just to check in. He said yes a few times, out of habit, but every gathering left him more drained than the last. Small talk felt like climbing uphill with weights on his legs. Someone would bring up a news story about the war, and all the air would leave his chest. He could feel eyes glancing at him, expecting him to have an opinion, a story, some insider perspective. But his truth wasn't one he could serve neatly over paper plates and plastic cups. The invitations came less often. People assumed he wanted space. In a way, he did, but it wasn't the kind of space they imagined. His world became smaller, pared down to what felt manageable. Work, home, the occasional grocery trip. He took a job at a warehouse on the edge of town, where the hum of machinery was loud enough to drown out thoughts and the tasks were repetitive, enough to keep his hands busy without opening any mental doors. Isolation has a strange way of shaping a person. At first, it feels like a choice closing the door because it's too cold outside. But over time, the door starts to feel heavier, harder to open. The longer you stay in, the more the outside world becomes foreign. Daniel's days blurred into each other, marked only by small routines. Coffee at 6, lunch at noon, the quiet walk to his truck when his shift ended. He didn't need a calendar to tell him time was passing, so he could see it in the fine lines forming at the corners of his eyes, in the way the town storefronts changed without him noticing until months later. He avoided places that might pull at old threads. No veterans reunions, no parades, no conversations about politics or foreign affairs. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that he cared too much, and caring meant risking that someone might ask the question, the one that would force him to either lie or tell the truth. And the truth wasn't something he trusted in the hands of just anyone. The cost of that choice was subtle but constant. His mother's calls grew shorter. Friends moved. Unbuilt families posted pictures of vacations and anniversaries he wasn't part of. Sometimes he'd scroll through social media and see faces he recognized but couldn't quite place any more people who had once been central to his life, now living in a parallel world he didn't belong to. He told himself it was fine. that he preferred it this way, that the quiet was safer. But deep down, he knew isolation had reshaped him in ways he couldn't fully see. His identity had thinned, stripped of the parts that connected him to others. He wasn't the Daniel from before the war, and he wasn't the soldier anymore either. He was something in between, a man defined less by what he did and more by what he refused to speak about. Sometimes, the middle of the night, he'd wake to the sound of his own voice, speaking words he couldn't remember when he was awake. Other times, he'd catch himself staring at nothing for minutes at a time, lost in a reel of memories he'd sworn not to watch again. These were the moments he felt the toll most clearly, not in his body, but in his sense of self. It was as if every year of silence had chipped away a little more of who he was, leaving him with a version of himself he barely recognized. And yet, even in those 10 years, the truth never dulled. It stayed sharp, like a shard of glass you keep in your pocket, always aware of its edge. He could almost feel it sometimes, pressing against him when he saw certain images on the news or heard certain words in passing. The memory was patient. It didn't rush. It knew he wasn't ready, and it waited. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic. Because those 10 years of isolation weren't just about distance from people. They were about the slow, quiet transformation of a man trying to live without confronting the moment that had defined him more than any other. It's in that space between who he was and who he became that the real story begins to take shape. Comment here, I can feel the weight of those years. If you understand the cost of carrying something alone for that long. Chapter 4. The Unexpected. Reunion. It happened on a day that began like any other. Daniel had settled into a rhythm that made his life predictable, safe in its own muted way. The warehouse was his cocoon, a place where the noise was mechanical and impersonal, where nobody asked questions that wandered too close to the past. That morning, the sun was pale through the winter clouds, and the parking lot was dotted with patches of snow from the night before. He clocked in, nodded to the usual faces, and moved through the familiar motions of lifting, sorting, and stacking. There was no reason to think that this day would be any different from the 1,000 that had come before it. But life has a way of folding in on itself, bringing the past to your doorstep when you least expect it. For Daniel, it began with a voice deep, accented, and instantly recognizable in a way that sent a shiver through him before his mind could even form the memory. He froze, one hand still gripping the side of a pallet, his chest tightening as the sound carried across the concrete floor. The logical part of him argued that it couldn't be. That after all these years, the man tied to that voice would be a world away, living a life entirely separate from his own. But logic had little say in the way his body reacted. He turned slowly, almost afraid of confirming what his instincts were already screaming. And there he was. Older, yes, time had carved lines into his face and salted his hair, but there was no mistaking him. The same eyes, the same measured way of scanning a room, as if reading it before taking a single step. In an instant, Daniel was no longer standing on the polished floor of an Ohio warehouse. He was back in the heat and dust of a foreign street. The air thick with tension, the crack of distant gunfire echoing like an afterthought. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and Daniel felt the breath leave his lungs. It wasn't recognition in the way you see an old friend at the grocery store. This was something deeper, something that carried weight. A shared history neither of them had chosen, but both had survived. And beneath the shock was something Daniel hadn't expected to feel: uncertainty. Was this man still an enemy? Had he ever truly been? Or was he simply another person carrying his own invisible scars? The room seemed to shrink around them, filled with unspoken words and the ghost of a moment neither had spoken about in a decade. Daniel's mind was a storm, memories colliding with questions, emotions tangling with instincts. He could see flashes of that day, fragments of an encounter that had shaped his silence for 10 years. The sweat in his palms, the sound of hurried footsteps, the split-second decision that had gone against everything he thought he knew about war and loyalty. And yet, here they were. Two men who had once stood on opposite sides of a line drawn by others, now face to face in a place where the war felt like another lifetime and, yet not far enough away. Daniel didn't move toward him, didn't speak. It was as if the air between them was too thick to cut through. But in that space, there was a current, an unspoken acknowledgement that neither could ignore. He didn't know if this was fate, coincidence, or some quiet form of reckoning. All he knew was that his carefully constructed walls had cracked in an instant. The armor he had spent 10 years perfecting suddenly felt heavier, less protective, as though it might collapse under the weight of the memories rushing back. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because that moment standing in the same room with the one person who knew the truth Daniel had guarded so fiercely was more than a reunion. It was the reopening of a door he had sworn to keep locked, and what lay beyond it would change everything. Right here, I can feel the tension. If you can already sense the impact this meeting is about to have. Chapter 5. Breaking the Silence 4. The rest of that day, Daniel tried to convince himself that the encounter in the warehouse hadn't happened, or, at least, that it hadn't mattered. He told himself he could go home, sleep it off, and return to the rhythm of his life as if nothing had shifted. But the truth was, something had. It was subtle at first, like a hairline fracture in glass, almost invisible, but carrying the potential to shatter everything if enough pressure was applied. That pressure came faster than he expected. He found himself replaying the sound of that voice, the way those eyes had met his without flinching. In his mind, it collided with another image, the day in the desert when their paths had first crossed. The moment he had expected to be one of violence, but instead became something else entirely. He had spent 10 years burying it, locking it away in the hope that time would make it fade. But seeing that man again had pulled it into the light, and now it was demanding to be acknowledged. That night, Daniel barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back there, dust swirling in the air, the smell of oil and heat, the weight of his rifle heavy in his hands. He remembered the sound of footsteps approaching, the way his pulse had pounded in his ears, the instant recognition that the figure before him wasn't one of his own. And then, the decision. A decision that defied the instinct drilled into him during training. The one that told him to act first, think later. Instead, in that split second, he had hesitated. And that hesitation had changed everything. By morning, it was clear he couldn't go on pretending. The meeting in the warehouse hadn't just stirred up old memories, it had cracked the dam. For the first time in 10 years, Daniel felt an almost physical pull to speak. But who could he tell? Who would believe him without twisting the meaning? And what if, by telling it, he was exposing something that was better left in the shadows? Trigger came in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't in the form of a dramatic confrontation or a direct conversation with the man from his past. It came in the shape of a young worker at the warehouse, barely 20, who asked Daniel during lunch if war stories were ever as clear-cut as the movies made them seem. The question was innocent enough, but it lodged in Daniel's mind like a splinter. He could have brushed it off with a joke or a vague answer, but instead, he found himself pausing, the silence between them stretching just long enough for the young man to notice. Something about that moment broke through the wall. Maybe it was the way the question was asked, not as a demand for entertainment or proof of bravery, but as a genuine search for understanding. Maybe it was the realization that if he stayed silent, the truth would remain locked away, invisible not just to others, but to himself. Or maybe it was that the memory of that day, of what his so-called enemy had done, no longer felt like something shameful. It felt like something human, something worth sharing. By the end of his shift, Daniel knew he couldn't keep it in any longer. His chest felt tight, but not in the suffocating way it had for years. This was different. This was the tension before a release, the kind that told him that once the words left his mouth, there would be no going back. He didn't plan it. There was no script. He simply found himself walking into the break room, where a couple of coworkers sat talking and saying quietly, "There's something I've never told anyone." The room went still, and for a heartbeat, he considered backing out. But the pull was too strong now. For 10 years, he had lived in a self-imposed silence, letting the world believe whatever it wanted about his time in the war. But the truth, the real truth, had a gravity all its own. And in that moment, it had finally outweighed his fear. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the story Daniel was about to share wasn't just a memory, it was a revelation. A hidden truth that would force anyone who heard it to question their own definitions of loyalty, morality, and what it really means to be human in the middle of conflict. Comment here. I'm ready for the truth if you can feel that this moment is about to change everything. Chapter 6. What the enemy did. Daniel's voice was low, steady, but there was something in it that made the room shift. He didn't look directly at anyone as he began, his eyes fixed on some point far beyond the walls around them. It was the middle of a patrol, he said, out near a small village, hotter than hell that day. The air felt heavy, like it was trying to press you into the ground. His hands rested on the table, fingers slightly curled, as if even now he could still feel the coarse grip of his weapon. We were moving along a narrow road when it happened. Gunfire from somewhere up ahead. Everything went into chaos. Shouts, the sound of rounds hitting dirt, the sharp crack of rifles in the distance. He paused, the memory moving through him as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to resurface. I broke from my unit to get better cover. Took a wrong turn down an alley I thought was clear. His jaw tightened. It wasn't. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the vending machine. I came face to face with him. Enemy uniform, rifle in his hands. We locked eyes, and I swear I could feel the next few seconds stretching out like an eternity. My training told me exactly what to do. My finger was already on the trigger. He took a slow breath, but before I could move, something hit. A blast close enough to throw me against a wall. My rifle went flying. My ears were ringing so loud, I couldn't even hear myself breathing. He leaned back slightly, his gaze unfocused, as if watching it unfold all over again. When I came to, I realized I'd taken shrapnel in my leg. Couldn't move. I was sure that was it. I was done. And then, he hesitated. Not because he didn't remember, but because putting it into words meant changing the way everyone in that room would see the world. He was still there, standing over me. But he didn't finish it. He dropped his rifle to the ground. The image was burned into him. The man kneeling, his hands moving quickly to stop the bleeding. The faint smell of dust and smoke. The strange calm in the middle of chaos. He pulled a tourniquet from somewhere, his own gear, I think, and wrapped it tight around my leg. Said something in broken English. Just one word I understood. Live. Then he got up, grabbed his rifle, and disappeared before my unit found me. Daniel's voice caught slightly on the last sentence. He saved me. An enemy, someone who could have ended me in seconds, chose to save me instead. And I never saw him again until last week. The room stayed quiet, the weight of what he'd just said hanging there, heavy and undeniable. The kind of truth that didn't need embellishment. It was all in the simplicity of the act and the way it defied every rule, every expectation, every line that had been drawn between them by the war. Daniel didn't offer an explanation because there wasn't one that could make perfect sense. It was an act that lived outside the usual logic of battle, a decision made by a man who, for reasons Daniel still didn't fully understand, chose humanity over the mission. And for 10 years, Daniel had carried that moment like a hidden fault line, unsure of what would happen if it ever cracked open. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the question that haunted Daniel after that day wasn't just why the man had done it to, was what that decision meant for everything Daniel thought he knew about loyalty, morality, and the way we define each other in times of conflict. Right here, I believe in humanity. If this moment strikes you as powerfully as it did him. Chapter 7, Humanity in Warfare. Days after finally speaking the words aloud, Daniel found himself circling the same thought. How could compassion survive in a place built to destroy it? War was supposed to be about absolutes, clear sides, clear objectives, clear consequences. You were trained to see the other as a threat, nothing more. And yet, in the one moment that could have confirmed everything he had been taught, an enemy had chosen to do the exact opposite. That choice didn't erase the pain or the loss, but it cracked open the rigid structure Daniel had been carrying in his mind for years. He started to think about how, even in the most brutal parts of human history, stories like his existed, hidden in the margins, whispered about in survivor accounts, sometimes only emerging decades later. Accounts of soldiers in the trenches of World War I, exchanging cigarettes on Christmas Eve. Stories from Vietnam of opposing fighters warning civilians to flee before an attack. Moments when the rules of conflict were suspended. Not because anyone ordered it, but because the human instinct to preserve life overpowered the mission to take it. Daniel realized that what happened to him was not an accident, not a fluke. It was part of a much older truth that humanity can survive even where it's least expected, but it takes courage to act on it. And maybe that was what unsettled him most. The courage in that moment hadn't come from him, it had come from the man whose very existence he had been conditioned to see as a threat. That reversal forced Daniel to examine the way he had defined loyalty and morality. If the boundaries between friend and foe could dissolve so completely in an instant, what else about his understanding of the world was built on fragile ground? It wasn't just about that single act of kindness. It was about the way it shifted his mindset, the way it made him question the narratives he had inherited from both training and culture. He began to see that war is as much about the stories we tell afterward as it is about the battles themselves. There's the official version, the one that fits neatly into political speeches, recruitment posters, and history books. And then there's the behind-the-scenes version, the one lived by the people who were there, full of contradictions, blurred lines, and quiet moments that don't make it into official records because they don't fit the script. For 10 years, Daniel had kept his behind-the-scenes version locked away, worried that telling it would make him seem disloyal, that it would somehow diminish his service or betray the brothers he fought alongside. But the more he thought about it now, the more he understood that sharing it was not betrayal, it was a reclamation of truth. That day on the battlefield was as real as any mission, any injury, any medal, and it carried a kind-of impact no official recognition could measure. There was also something deeply humbling about realizing that his survival was tied to someone who had every reason to end his life. That man's decision had not only preserved Daniel's heartbeat, had preserved years of his journey that would follow. Every moment he'd experienced since then, every choice he'd made, every transformation in his own character. They were all rooted in a single act of mercy from someone who, by all logic, should have been his undoing. And in a way, that was the paradox that haunted him. How something so pure could emerge from something so destructive. How two people could meet in the ugliest circumstances imaginable and still walk away, connected not by ideology, not by allegiance, but by a shared understanding that life, in its rawest form, is worth preserving. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because while that moment gave Daniel a new lens to see humanity, it also left him with an unresolved tension how to live with the weight of gratitude for someone the world still expected him to call an enemy. Right here, I see the paradox if you understand the complexity of what Daniel is wrestling with. Chapter 8. The transformation. Something shifted in Daniel after that day in the break room. And it wasn't the kind of shift you feel for a few hours and then forget. It was deeper, like a fault line inside him had moved and everything above it had to rearrange. For the first time in a decade, he didn't feel like he was dragging a secret behind him everywhere he went. The weight wasn't gone. Truth doesn't erase what happened, but it was lighter, more manageable, because it was finally out in the open. In the days that followed, something surprising happened. A few of his coworkers, people who had never spoken much about anything beyond work, approached him quietly, sharing their own pieces of pain. Some were veterans themselves. Others carried entirely different kinds of wounds. Loss, betrayal, moments in life that had broken something inside them. It dawned on Daniel that by speaking his truth, he had given permission for others to speak theirs. That realization became the first real transformation in his mindset. For years, he had believed silence was strength, that keeping it all locked away was the only way to protect himself and others. Now, he could see that silence had also been a prison. Opening up didn't just free him, it opened doors for the people around him. And it wasn't only about conversation. Something inside him began to reconnect. The world didn't feel as dim, and people didn't feel as far away. He started saying yes to invitations again, testing the edges of a social life he thought he'd left behind for good. Small steps: coffee with an old friend, a trip to the farmer's market on a Saturday morning, walking into the local gym instead of running alone at night. They were ordinary things, but for him, they were markers of a life coming back into color. He also noticed a change in the way he thought about his service. For years, the story of his time at war had been dominated by the guilt of surviving when others hadn't, and by the confusion of being saved by someone he was supposed to see as an enemy. Now, instead of letting that memory isolate him, he began to let it guide him. He realized that the act of compassion he had received was a thread connecting him to something much bigger: universal truth about empathy and moral courage. Daniel began to attend veteran support groups, not as someone looking for help, but as someone ready to offer it. The first time he told his story to a room full of other veterans, he could feel the air change, the same way it had in the break room. Some nodded, some looked down at the floor, lost in their own memories. Afterward, one man approached him and said, "I didn't know we were allowed to talk about moments like that." That sentence stayed with Daniel. It reminded him how many others might be carrying their own forbidden stories, the ones that don't fit neatly into the framework of heroism or victory, the ones that are messy, human, and quietly profound. Sharing his truth became more than catharsis. It became a way of planting seeds in others, showing them that their humanity, even in the darkest moments, was worth speaking about. With time, the transformation went even further. Daniel started volunteering with organizations that helped veterans transition back into civilian life, not just with jobs or housing, but with honest conversations about what they'd been through. He spoke to high school classes about the reality of war, not to discourage, but to offer a fuller picture. And every time he told his story, he made sure to include the part about the man who had spared his life. It was still hard. The memory still carried pain, confusion, and unanswered questions. But now, it also carried purpose. What had once been a wound that kept him separate from others had become a bridge that connected him to people he might never have met otherwise. Daniel understood that the stick that saved him wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. It was about taking something that had once been a source of silence and turning it into a reason to speak. It was about learning that the most profound moments of connection often come from the least expected places, and that carrying them forward is a way of honoring both the giver and the gift. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because while Daniel had found a new sense of purpose, there was still one step left in his journey facing the man who had changed everything, and seeing what would happen when their paths crossed again. Right here, I believe in second chances if you can see how this transformation could open the door to what came next. Chapter 9, and now. Daniel came to understand something that had taken him years to even approach. The real power of that moment on the battlefield wasn't just in the fact that it saved his life, was in the way it forced him to reimagine what it meant to live. For so long, he had measured survival in terms of making it through the day, of keeping his head down and his heart guarded. But survival, he realized now, was more than staying alive. It was allowing yourself to be transformed by the things that could have broken you, and letting those transformations ripple outward. What that man had done for him wasn't an apology for the war, or an erasure of the damage done on both sides. It was a choice made in a split second to act from humanity instead of hostility. And that choice had traveled with Daniel every day since, not as a debt to be repaid, but as a reminder that even in the most divided circumstances, there is room for a different kind of decision. He began to see how this truth wasn't limited to the battlefield. In ordinary life, people are faced with their own lines drawn between us and them, between who deserves our kindness and who doesn't. Those lines can be political, personal, even invisible. And yet, the same paradox applies. Compassion doesn't need permission from the situation to exist. It can cross borders, histories, and wounds. It can show up in a moment when it makes no sense at all. And that's precisely why it matters. Daniel realized that holding on to anger, mistrust, or old definitions of loyalty had kept him trapped, just as much as his silence had. Real forgiveness wasn't about excusing the harm that had been done. It was about refusing to let that harm dictate the shape of your life. It was about making room for the possibility that someone could be more than the role they had been assigned in your story. And this lesson stretched far beyond war. In relationships, in communities, in everyday conflicts, the same choice exists. We can stay inside the script we've been given, or we can step outside it and write a new one when that acknowledges the past but isn't bound to it. Daniel had learned that the courage to do that often comes from seeing it in someone else first. Looking back, he could see that the man who spared him had given him more than a second chance at life. He had given him a living example of what it meant to defy the expected. It was a hidden truth Daniel carried into every interaction afterward. You never know the weight of the decision you're making for someone else, or how far its impact will reach. For Daniel, the act of finally telling his story wasn't just about unburdening himself, which was about placing that truth into the world where it could do its own work. He wanted it to land in the ears of someone who needed permission to choose differently, to offer grace instead of retaliation, to speak instead of staying silent. The story had stopped being just his. It had become something that could belong to anyone willing to see themselves in it. And maybe that's the real takeaway, that in every life, there are moments when we're given the chance to act from the narrow version of ourselves or from the expanded one. The narrow self follows the script, stays safe, and plays the part. The expanded self listens for the deeper voice, the one that whispers, "Live," even when the world is telling you to destroy. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because while Daniel had embraced the lesson, there was still an unanswered question pressing at the edges of his mind: what it would mean to stand face to face with the man who had changed everything, and what truths might surface when they finally spoke. Right here, I choose humanity. If you believe that even in the darkest places, compassion can change the story. If this conversation If you've stayed with me all the way to this point, it probably means the story spoke to you in some way. Maybe it stirred a memory, maybe it opened a new perspective, or maybe it just reminded you that, even in the most unlikely moments, there's still space for humanity to shine through. If that's the case, I'd love for you to let me know you were here until the very end. Leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end." If this conversation felt valuable to you, if it gave you something to think about or carry into your own life, consider subscribing so you can be part of the next stories we share here. That way, you'll always have a place to return to when you want more than just noise, when you want meaning. And if you felt a connection today, a simple like on this video is enough to let me know we're on the right path together. There's a video right here that complements this one perfectly. Click and continue with me there. Who knows, the next story might just be the one you needed to hear today.